I am no different to any other person that paints models. I see a pretty model on Instagram, I follow the person, I save pictures of the models, I screenshot them, and I try to figure out how they did it and how I can do it. And I steal color schemes. When I saw this towel scheme from OCD Towel on Instagram, I followed him immediately and I fell in love with the scheme. I decided I would reach out to him and ask his permission to actually paint this scheme, or at least attempt to, for a video. He loved the idea and he ended up actually sending me the exact recipe to follow. So instead of me trying to wing it and probably getting the wrong shade of green and being frustrated and giving up on the project, I dove straight in. We start the model by priming black. I'm not sure which primer he used, doesn't really matter. I used an airbrush and used Pro Acryl's black primer. The next step is using an airbrush and Vallejo Game Color Escorpina Green. Now I thought this step was particularly interesting because generally I would start with a much darker color and build lighter layers upon that, pulling the paint towards the top of the model, kind of where I would want the light source to create, brighter reflections and creating natural shadows, and really utilizing the airbrush to cheat some light blending into the miniature. But no, we dive straight into the brightest color of the entire miniature. So I thinned it down quite a bit and built up a couple of layers because I didn't want to flood the model with paint. The coverage with this paint is pretty good, but not the best. So I tried to be pretty careful with it. Now, before I go too much further into painting this Tau battlesuit, I just wanted to shout out my Patreon. A few of you guys have joined on since the last video and I really appreciate that. This is how I'm going to go about supporting myself making these videos, paying for projects, and hopefully one day making this a viable full-time thing. I'm currently giving away this Cerastus Knight to a Patreon that's going to be in early February, and that's one of the many benefits that you guys can find over there. Now, I want to specifically thank Drew, Pac-Man, and Troy for their ongoing support. This really helps me in creating these videos. So if you want to help support me, head on over to patreon.com/paintbyaz. Check out what I offer in all of my different tiers. And enough shilling, let's get back into painting this battlesuit. Now, Matt told me that he used specific stencils, vinyl stencils that you can buy for the kind of shard camo pattern. I didn't want to buy stencils purely to try out this one scheme. I also didn't want to wait for them to arrive. So I have painter's tape, plenty of it. I decided I would give cutting out just random jagged shapes a go. So as you can see, I stupidly started out trying to cut out a very specific shape from the middle of the tape. By the end of it here, I have just gotten into the rhythm of it and I'm just cutting random pieces off here and there, trying to keep it as random as I can, different sizes, different shapes, different widths, different lengths, and I'm just sticking them all over the model. I'm using both my finger to manipulate the model into the creases, as well as I used a Q-tip to really kind of push it into some of the odd areas that I couldn't get my fat fingers into. Once the tape was all over the model, the next step is to take an airbrush. I thinned this down quite a lot because I didn't want to paint anything too thick too quick, but not enough that any paint would bleed because I didn't want anything to go run under the tape and ruin the camo. But we use Vallejo Game Color Dark Green, and Matt told me that he paints this essentially all over the model now, but in varying amounts of opacity. So what I gathered from pictures of his model is he generally painted darker towards where the camo shapes are covered up, which makes sense. Yeah, that creates the most stark contrast. The dark color that we're painting now over what, when unmasked, will be the brightest part of the model. So I essentially figured if I just sprayed from far enough away but targeted the camo shapes, most of what's left will be covered, but it will create a gradient across everything that's not covered up by our current masking. I started out using a pair of tweezers, but quickly transitioned to just using my finger to roll the paint off. Initially, I was too scared that I would kind of rub paint off with my finger, but after using the tweezers a bit, I ended up scratching the model a couple of times, which really frustrated me. But as you can see from where we've really targeted the shard shapes, it creates a massive amount of contrast very quickly, and the kind of modulation of darkness in the rest of the green looks really, really good. I then gloss varnished the model and mixed up an oil wash. Now, Matt told me that he pin washes the entire model with Nuln Oil, which seemed like torture. He said he was really excited to see how I would tackle the model, to see if there are any ways that I could actually speed up his scheme, because he said that it takes him quite a long time to get any of these done. So maybe he will give oil washes a go, because I could not imagine doing an entire Tau suit the way he does it, with every single crease, every single nook and cranny covered with Nuln Oil by hand. That just sounds like absolute torture. So mixing some black, the camo green, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, and some Abteilung 502 fast dry thinner, I mixed up an oil wash that was not too thin, because I wanted the wash to be quite opaque, but obviously thin enough for, you know, the capillary action to just pull the oil right into all of those recesses. I then made a Q-tip slightly damp with that same 502 thinner after giving the oil about an hour to dry, and went in and just cleaned up anywhere where oil had spilled, or anywhere where I'd kind of just missed my target or it had bled over a little bit. I then hit the model with AK Interactive's Ultramatte Varnish, and it was time for what's probably my least favorite step of any Tau model, and that's kind of blacking out anything that's not armor after the fact. Other than cutting out the shapes, this is probably the longest step, and it's the least fun, but it's very rewarding, as you can see once it's finished. I then took an airbrush and just with some Liquitex titanium white ink, I very, very carefully sprayed some kind of metallic-y bright highlights into the armor. Matt doesn't usually do this. He goes straight in and just edge highlights everything, but I really like doing this, especially for Tau models. I feel like it adds a lot for very little effort. I then took a kind of medium blue-gray and went around and edge highlighted pretty much all of the black parts. And then after that, I just took a lighter gray and highlighted the higher areas, especially around where I've airbrushed. The next part of this scheme is to take straight Escorpina green, so that same green that we initially painted the model, and edge highlight all of the armor panels. Now, in his scheme, he leaves all of these kind of, I still don't know what they actually are, weird circular bits green along with the armor, but I decided to paint them black along with everything else. I just added some quick blended highlights with the same grays as before. I got excited and skipped recording while painting the missiles, but I just painted them with some Vallejo Game Color Stonewall Grey, then added some white to that and just kind of hit the higher edges of those cylinders. Then for the lenses, I did a very quick pass with a brush using that same titanium ink that we used before, and covered all of the lenses as well as these weird little, balls all over the model. I don't know what they are. After that, I then painted them with Vallejo Game Colors Fluoro Red, and then added a little spot highlight of white after that red had dried. It was then time to paint the head, so I primed it the same black and then gave it a thin airbrush with Vallejo Game Color Verdigris. I wanted it to be close to white, but also slightly blue. I'm not sure why that's the direction I went with. I just guess I wanted an interesting color in there, so that's what appealed to me on my paint rack. I then gave it a quick airbrush highlight with that same titanium white ink again. Gloss varnished the model and then gave it an oil wash with Abteilung 502's Payne's Grey, which is a really nice kind of deep bluey grey color. I then decided that these kind of outer cylinder parts of the antennas would look nice as the same green as the model, so I went with that. I blacked out the interior part of the head, the outside of the antennas, and then gave the lenses that same white ink and then red fluoro paint treatment. It was then time to complete the sub-assembly and kind of see how he looks together. It was nice to see how the model comes together after having it set throughout the entire paint process. It's also weird not kind of using a zenithal style for me to really guide shadow onto the model. I think it's a bit more cartoony, but it adds to how vibrant and punchy this scheme is. I didn't want to give him a normal base, so I remembered this really crappy little Space Marine that I painted years and years and years ago, who was taking space on a perfectly good plinth. So since it was incredibly dusty, I gave it a quick wipe off, ripped the Marine off, and just using a blade cleaned off the basing material that was on there. I picked out this pine bark and just kind of honestly winged it. I used super glue and just pieced together what would look like a nice little gradient. I wanted to create a rocky, rainforesty type base to match the colors for this model. Of course, after sticking down all the rocks, I thought about the idea of having a little crashed drone there just to really, add to the flavor of the base. So I had to cut off that middle rock so the drone would fit, chopped the drone in half, used a blade to really damage it up and stuck him on there. I then built up some super glue quickly just around the base of the drone, just so as I could drop some of my mix of random basing grit in there and really kind of make him feel like he's baked into the base rather than just, stuck on the top. I then took one of my favorite little tricks and cut off the tops of some cheap aquarium plants for some ferns and used that same painting tape as before to mask off the outside of the plinth before painting it. I then gave the base a quick black prime and painted the drone in the exact same way as the battlesuit. Now to paint the rocks, I went with a slightly different process than I would usually do. I kind of copied Andy Wardle from Cult of Paint's style with this. So I went with a Skaven Light Dinge base coat, but sprayed from the side to create natural shadows like how I would any other model normally. I then added some Vallejo model color olive green, which is a much brighter but kind of off-tone green, and then some black just to darken it down, because olive green mixed into the Skaven Light just by itself would be way too light. And then gave that another second pass just for some more highlights. And then I took what was left in the airbrush and poured it out onto my palette. You can see it in the top there, that's that green. And then some Stonewall Grey, which is the lower lighter grey, and mixed them together and slowly but surely highlighted and stippled up all of the rocks. This is how it looks after. The top layer was probably about 50-50 Stonewall and that original green. I then thinned down some Rhinox hide from Games Workshop and painted that all over the dirt surfaces. And while it was still dry, I kind of dabbed in some thinned scale 75 Gobi brown, just for some color variation. It's not going to be very obvious. You can see there, you can barely see it, but it does create some interest in that dirt rather than it just being straight brown. I then wanted to try out one of my Dirty Down products that I haven't really played with much yet. I've had great success with their Rust and Verdigris, but I haven't really played with the Moss. Honestly, I don't know if it was me. I shook it forever. I played with reactivating it with water, heating it up beforehand. Like, I just couldn't get it to look good. Don't get me wrong, it looks fine as is. It's just very dark. There's no color variation, but I was able to really easily fix that by just dry brushing some Vallejo model color livery green, which is a slightly yellow, very, very bright green. I'm lucky in the fact that I did this over pine rocks, so there was just a lot of natural raised areas just to catch the dry brush. Had it been a flat surface, I don't think it would have looked anywhere near as good. You can maybe stipple a little bit, but for what it was, I think it came out really well. I then wanted to paint the ferns a little bit colder since all the greens on there and the rest of the base were all quite warm. So I mixed together some scurvy green and dark green and gave it a base coat. I then slowly added in more and more Escalpina green to brighten it up, but still keep it that cold tone of green. And just followed where I thought the natural shape of the veins in these ferns would be, covering less and less surface with each step. Now I'm taking a big risk with this. I'm using AK Interactive's Still Water, which is a water effect, but it's quite thick. So I figured I might be able to get away with just mixing in some Bale Tarn green from Games Workshop, just to give it a little bit of color. You can see it in the pipette there, and dropping it onto the model. I wanted this to be submerged in water, but I didn't have any way to really cover it up properly. So I figured I could maybe just get away with doing a little bit on the top and have it hopefully not run off the edges. this actually worked out really well for me. Obviously it doesn't give it the same level of depth that I would love to have. Maybe I can come back later and coat it properly and then do a proper water effect. But for now, I'm happy enough with this. I then drilled a small little hole in his foot and in the base, attached some brass rod, stuck him into the base, painted that brass rod black, and then I was able to call it done. The final step, of course, was the last little bit of satisfying unmasking of the plinth, and then just covering up the last little bits of the top with some black paint. And with that, I will leave you with the final beauty shots.